Good afternoon. I want to thank you for joining me today, watching this video as part of our Old Testament survey series. Today we're going to be looking at an overview of the book of Genesis. We're not going to get bogged down into many of the details, but really looking at an overview. Again, this is part of an Old Testament survey class, something that I'm working on as part of my studies. And so I am basing most of this off of my textbook, with, of course, other additions along the way. And my textbook is the Dictionary of the Old Testament Pentateuch, written by Desmond T. Alexander and David W. Baker, part of the Compendium of Contemporary Biblical Scholarship series of Bible dictionaries. And again, one of the things that I find interesting in this series, I have many Bible dictionaries that I've used over the years, but none that are focused at a smaller section of the Bible. So that's been kind of helpful, really helpful, looking at these issues from the perspective of a cluster of Scripture, and then, of course, applying them and comparing on a larger setting. So in this overview, we'll look at three things: the structure of the book, the plot of the book, and the theology contained within the book. As the first book of the Old Testament, Genesis really sets the stage for everything that is going to come. And we do ourselves a disservice if we skip over the Genesis and the rest of the Old Testament and just kind of pick out those verses and those books that we're used to. But starting at the beginning, it really lays the foundation of the narrative that's going to play out throughout the Old Testament that really does set the stage for the coming of the Messiah and so many of the blessed truths that we love so dearly. It sets the stage for the rest of the Scripture and specifically for the Pentateuch that will follow those first five books of the Bible. So in the structure of the book, one of the things that really helps us get the structure and the flow and the changes that go on, the structure is really dictated primarily by the genealogies that are found in it. Everyone likes to joke about how you have those massive genealogies in Genesis 5 and Genesis 10 that break up your reading and are rough to get through. So-and-so begat so-and-so and those types of things. But the genealogies serve a purpose in the information that they convey, but they also help us to see the structure of the book, dividing into the major sections, and often even the midsection. It's a clue that something is about to change or that something has just changed. There are really, most would agree there are two major sections to the book of Genesis. You see this often, that the first would be chapters 1 through 11. If we're getting really particular though, we would start in Genesis 1:1 and end that section at Genesis 11:26, because that chapter ends with some genealogies that help us see that one section is ended, another is beginning. You really get led into the Abrahamic narrative towards the end of chapter 11, not precisely at the beginning of chapter 12. But for sake of ease, usually we just say Genesis 1 through 11 and then 12 through 50. But again, being particular, Genesis 1, 11 through 26 gives us the primeval history. It's a very universal focus. Starts with the only humans alive in Genesis 1 and 2. Then it deals with the dealings in the rest of the world, and then even with Noah. It's very universal, the sinfulness of the world, God's grace on Noah, and then working through his family, again, now the only humans that are there. But then it really focuses down into one family. In Genesis 11:27 through 50:26, it all really is based on the ancestral history, particularly the history of Abraham and his descendants. The book doesn't really, it does somewhat flow going from person to person, Abraham to Isaac to Jacob to Joseph, but in reality, it's organized around the significance of those other characters is not found in themselves, but is first found in their connection to Abraham as his heirs, as the heirs of the covenant through him. So the plot. In the very beginning, chapter 1:11 through 11:26, again, is the primeval history, and the main characters that are Adam and Noah. In this section, the individual episodes are really self-contained. They don't flow as much as just like, here's one narrative, goes on to the next, to the next. And just as the genealogies move steadily from one to the next, so do those narratives. They don't really blend over or go from one to the next quite as much. They just flow from one to the next. The thematic connections are what binds these episodes together. And the individual characters, there's not really a lot of time developing. You don't get, other than the one statement really of Noah's finding favor, God placing his favor in Noah, Noah finding favor in the eyes of the Lord, and some of his narrative, we see his faith in building the ark and some of the downfalls maybe later. We don't have a really broad development of the character of Noah or the character of Adam like we do with Abraham or with a Joseph. So there's not a lot of time given for this complex characterization or sophisticated plot elaboration. Things kind of move, and it really does flow to get us through. There's themes that are picked up that build to starting with Abraham and what's going to happen in that ancestral history. But that's not to say that the first 11 chapters are merely to set something up. There's significant truth found in those passages. Again, we have that idea of grace so clearly seen in Genesis 6. God's sovereignty is seen throughout. So it's not that it's a minor portion. It works a little bit different. So then again, in chapter 11, 27 through chapter 50, we have the ancestral history, really focusing now, narrowing down to a particular lineage, Abraham and his descendants. And then the subcategories of this one, the subsections would be chapter 11, verse 27 through 25, 18, specifically tell the story of Abraham. The story of Abraham is dominated by its main character, Abraham, who appears in almost every episode found within that section. He provides both continuity and complexity to a section founded on divine promises and blessings. That's a key portion not only to the story of Abraham, but really all of Genesis, this promises and blessings. And this is found in a greater degree than in Genesis 1 through 11. The story now really seems to shift. God is really guiding the story. And we know theologically that's always what happens with God and his sovereignty. But as far as the narrative is concerned, God is clearly the key mover in creation and the way that he interacts with Adam and his descendants. Very clearly, and his hands deeply involved in what's going on with Noah. But as the narrative moves now to Abraham, God's transcendence is a little bit more prominent. And it follows Abraham and what he is doing. Again, theologically, we know that God is sovereign, he is at work, but for the sake of the narrative and the way that it's written, it focuses more on the human initiatives more than the divine decree. And then in Genesis 25:19 through 37:1, we start with Jacob's story. And it's kind of interesting that Isaac is the son of promise, yet he has a little bit of a small role, almost a passive role in what goes on. His biggest story, his biggest stories are really the being almost sacrificed. So it's really Abraham's story, and then it's the finding of his wife. So the Jacob story then in Genesis 25:19 through 37:1 has an even greater complexity. It is clearly less episodic. There's not more of these different episodes that are going on, and it's even more integrated than the Abraham story. The episodes are grouped together in larger, interrelated sections, such as you have Jacob's conflicts with Esau, his conflict with Laban. He really lives a life of conflict. You wouldn't look at Abraham and say he's a one-dimensional, simple character, but Jacob is immensely more complex, even to some extent enigmatic. And if that's not clear anywhere else, it's clear in his morality, the way that he approaches life, and often a deceitful or at best cunning individual. God is less dominant in the Abraham story than the primeval history, and that trend really continues into the Jacob story, where God appears even less frequently and is, again, more transcendent, really, other than the Jacob wrestling and the Jacob's ladder vision. Those are the primary roles where God is seen very clearly in that section of narrative. And then from there, it goes out to the story of Jacob's family, and it's really, even though the main character that will emerge is Joseph, just as all of these subsequent patriarchs, their significance is found in their lineage of Abraham. Even more so, Jacob's descendants, Joseph's significance is tied back to Jacob and the way that God worked through that. So the story of Jacob's family in chapter 37:2 through 50:26 brings us to the end of the book. The story of Jacob's family brings the increasingly sophisticated narrative Genesis to its end with really a masterful integration of plot and characterization. Really, we do see the greatest plot development really in that final section dealing with Joseph. There's a rise and a fall and all those emotions that go with that. More than in any other block in Genesis, this is a continuous story, and it emphasizes its human dimensions. Joseph is the central character, and it really, as far as active participants in the narrative are concerned, I want to be clear that we're not talking about theologically what's happening here, but as the active participants in the narrative, Joseph even really eclipsed God as to what's going on. It's focused on what's going on with Joseph, where he's going, and certainly he has a dependence in the Lord. His morality is seen clearly, but we're focusing on Joseph and what he's going on in that book. But paradoxically, even though Joseph is the most acutely portrayed of all the characters in Genesis, he is in the end one of the most baffling of all. And his story is just, it baffles us. So in many ways, if you compare that working of what's going on, the end of the book mirrors, not as a direct correlation, um, but it somewhat mirrors the beginning of the book in the primeval history, replacing the divine omnipresence and morally and unambiguous characters with the divine reticence and human ambivalence. So there's a mirroring there of what goes on. And then in this plot, there's the structure of it. There's that plot. In this plot, there's the different characters and who is important through that, how the narrative flows through. But a key feature throughout all of this is the promises and blessings. One has gone as far to say as the book's central core is found in its divine promises and blessings. If you remove these elements, the coherence of the book falls apart. It's just a history book with episodes that come one after another. But what holds the book together is this concept of promises and blessing. So investigating the book's plot, you have to put these elements in the foreground, and it takes us to the heart of the world of this narrative. So in the promises and blessing in the primeval history, the main issues that will dominate the plot of the primeval history, Genesis 1 through 11:26, are summarized in Genesis 1:28. So let's look at that verse. Genesis 1:28. And God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heaven, and over every living thing that moves on the earth." This command of being fruitful and multiplying has is the core of what's found in there. Dominates the primeval history. That's what we see going on. Adam and Eve. We have, of course, right after that they fall, but it's their descendants and how they're filling, and it builds to Genesis 6 with the flood promised and coming. Everyone's evil. So God somewhat doesn't recreate, but has that picture of destroying and starting over. And then with Noah, and then it's his family. He's again given those promises of to be, or the command to be fruitful and multiply, and the promises that go with it, that you will be fruitful and multiply. And so that sets the tone for what's going on. It concerns human multiplication, subjugation of the earth, and dominion over the animals. But this has complications, often even almost ironically throughout it. If you take it as a whole, the plot of the primeval history develops in complicated and surprising directions. In doing so, it sets the tone for the rest of the book. So then we have in the Abraham story, the promises and the blessings, and clearly promises, without even thinking about it, are a central part of the Abrahamic story. So the initial divine speech to Abraham in Genesis 12 concerns nationhood, land, and a blessing, or as one other has said, a person, a place, and a king. In Genesis 12, 1 through 3, now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So then we have this multiplication concept again, but now in a new and significant way. The general multiplication motif is transformed into a promise now of nationhood. And subjugation of the earth is transformed into the promise of land possession, as it will eventually be defined. But again, there's these almost ironic complications throughout. As Abraham is given this promise of an innumerable people, right away that might play into why he took Lot with him, saying, "Well, I don't have any children, I'm old, I'll have heirs through Lot." Well, then of course, everything goes sideways with Lot and they have to separate. And then he has, "Well, I don't have any children," and Sarah's recommendation is, "Well, get a handmaid, and I can't give you children, but she can." And then now here's the heir, Ishmael. Well, that doesn't work out, and they have to be sent away. That's not God's way. And almost every time that Abraham steps in, it messes things up. When the progress of the Abrahamic blessings and promises within the plot of the book of the whole is considered, it's clear that the resolution of numerous complications lies beyond Genesis. These are not simple promises that will be answered right now in one thing. Then as we move on in that ancestral history into the Jacob story in Genesis 25:19 through 37:1, the conflict between rival claimants to the line of promise is a sub-theme in the Abrahamic story, again with Lot and Ishmael, but now it becomes even more prominent in the Jacob story. You've got Jacob and Esau, um, and that's a major, that's one of the most significant stories in Jacob's narrative. It drives him out of the land and it sets the stage for everything that's going to happen with him. And then as he comes back in, you have that problem again that ends up being fine, but that tension of what's going to happen when I could run into Esau. And then in the story of Jacob's family, it's prefaced by two dreams. These predict the future relationships within the family and produce the strife central to the story's development. There is this, again, that concept of the wrong son is being blessed. That's what these dreams point towards. There's something major is going to happen, but it's one of the younger sons that you will all bow down to. And it's interesting that as you look at that, the way that the bowing works, it's definitely figurative. To speak, not that everyone will literally bow to him. We don't have any record of, his mom passed away probably before that could have happened. And it's actually Joseph who bows to Jacob when he comes to Egypt. But clearly that authority and that way that God will work is seen there, and the blessing then does come through Joseph in that way. So then in the conclusion of the plot, the individual narrative blocks of Genesis have a coherent plot development. The fact that the reader's expectations are rarely fulfilled in a straightforward way is not evidence of a lack of literary finesse, but rather the reverse. You're always set up, things are going to go this way, and then they don't. Things don't go this way, and then they don't. The outcome of individual episodes and of the book as a whole depend on the complex interplay between divine actions and pronouncements on the one hand and human initiatives on the other. This is hardly ever straightforward, but nevertheless, it is interesting. So then finally, the theology of the book. Genesis is a narrative book. It's not Romans. It doesn't teach, here's point A, point B, a logical flow. We get our theology from the narrative in the book. So its theology is conveyed through features such as structures, plot, characterization, rather than set pieces of divine teaching, as in the legal or prophetic texts or books of the New Testament, many of the books of the New Testament. So even the structure of the book has theological implication. The global focus in Genesis 1 through 11 provides a significant theological preface to the call of Abraham in Genesis 12, which then governs ancestral history. The universalism of primeval history is adopted as the subtext of the ancestral history, in which one family in focus will be the agent of blessing now for then all the families of the earth. So again, the genealogies structure the book and play into that. Such schematic genealogical elements convey the impression that there is an overriding divine scheme to human history. The broad sweep of generations is understandable and to some extent predictable. Moreover, through the genealogies, attention is focused on a particular family line that is central to God's purpose. And then the theme developed of seed, the seed motive is found in the narratives. And there almost seems to be two contrasting perspectives that produce a significant theological paradox regarding the relationship of God's divine sovereignty, as exemplified in the genealogies, and human free will, as demonstrated in the narratives. Genesis does not choose either option, but affirms the necessity of both, and it holds them in a theological tension. But then the undergirding truth, as we see throughout, is that even in that tension, God's will comes to pass, always. So the theological role of Genesis 1 through 11, it's been said by some that every major doctrine finds its seed in Genesis 1 through 11. We get to see the beginning of that from there. So from the unpromising beginning of the ordered universe is brought into existence by a God in a thoroughly systematic way, with the environments created on earth of the first 3 days being matched each of the next 3 days by the creatures that live or rule those environments. The initial disorder is balanced by the final rest of the sanctified time on the seventh day. And of course, we have the theological implications of promises and blessings. Human attempts often throughout to enforce the blessing. So God says this is going to happen, and then the humans are constantly trying to make it happen. They tend to almost always frustrate them. It's not about God saying this is going to happen and you figure out, but that undergirds that theme that also goes through of that need for faith that is seen in Abraham and in the end in Joseph very clearly. And by the end of the book, really none of the blessings or promises have been really fulfilled. Abraham and his family are supposed to have this land. Well, they're off in Egypt. We know already that we're kind of gearing up for what's going to come in Exodus when they're enslaved. That's hardly a blessed people that will be a blessing to others. So instead, these promises, these blessings and promises are inherited by the rest of the Pentateuch, developed by scriptures as a whole, and can only be properly understood when read against the background provided by Genesis. So in conclusion, Genesis does not present a static theology of God's involvement in humanity. But regardless of his mode of engagement, God is present. He's always present and active. Even as, again, the narrative starts focusing more on the individual humans and the families and the narratives and as the active participants, there's always this, as you're reading, God is involved. This is God's story that's going on. Sometimes it's just through the eye of faith even that we see that. So as such, Genesis provides an appropriate theological introduction to the rest of the Pentateuch, in which God's freedom to interact with his creation is amply demonstrated, and where God's commitment to the world cannot be negated by humanity's ambivalent attitude towards him. That God is working towards some end, and that end will come regardless of even our attitude towards him. He can do whatever it is he sets out to do. So that's the overview of the book of Genesis. Next week we will look at the book of Exodus and continue moving on.